I'm Catherine Mazzone here on behalf of MojoStreaming. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, if you haven't already, please subscribe. I want to welcome our guest, Colin Sytsma. Colin is a filmmaker and quite an accomplished one at that. He's been at it for about 10 years. And he's the first interview I've had so far where we're actually in the same time zone. Colin is currently based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, right? 15 degrees this morning?
Yes.
Yeah, a little bit frigid. Colin, I just want to start off, we're obviously talking to you because of your role in raising awareness and doing these films about enslaved animals. You do enslavement of all sentient beings. So tell me a little bit about what it is that you focus on in your film work.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you for having me. And my films are based around the enslavement of sentient beings. And so basically that means any being that can feel, right? So currently I'm making 3 feature-length documentaries. One is about incarceration and what families of incarcerated people are going through during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm making a feature about the only gorilla in Thailand and how she was trafficked there 33 years ago and has spent the last 3 decades in a shopping mall zoo. And then my third film that I'm working on is one about post-traumatic stress and how it echoes through generations of people and the impact of war. And so that one is kind of based around a lot of mental captivity.
It's really fascinating that you were drawn to this. I'm curious as to what made you decide to take up this fight.
Yeah, I like to research a lot. So I'm always kind of like on the computer looking at different stories. And I made this film with a friend of mine in Panama about deforestation and access to fresh drinking water. And that film ended up kind of playing all around the world. Didn't really have a big debut or anything, but we were young when we made it. And that really opened up a lot of doors for me and a lot of access points. And so one access point that I had was storytelling within the great apes. And so I've made about 3 films now that's in like a short film series called Stolen Apes. And so I've been lucky to work with an NGO based in Bangkok called Freeland, and they have offices all around the world in Brazil, in the United States, which one's really close to me here in Wisconsin. And they do some incredible work around wildlife trafficking and human slavery. And the founder of that, who is also the founder of Wild Age, Steve Galster, is from Wisconsin. So it is indeed a small world.
Really remarkable work. And you had to see this firsthand. What was that like for you as an individual, as just a regular person?
Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways, all of us get to see this firsthand. We don't really see the consequence. That's the problem. Because especially like in places like Florida or even rural Wisconsin, right? There's these roadside zoos that have a variety of different animals, right? And we go in there and we say, oh, wow, that's an orangutan, like, or this is a chimpanzee, like, this is beautiful, this is cool. But if it's not an accredited zoo, where did that animal come from, right? And then I got to see more of the kind of the consequence of this when I shot the first Stolen Apes film in Kenya. And I got to see how many trafficked apes were at this conservancy, the Sweetwater's Chimpanzee Sanctuary. And I realized that there was, you know, these apes, essentially what happens when they get a baby for trafficking, they go into a group of chimpanzees and essentially slaughter the whole group, eat those apes, and then take the babies for sale all around the world, anywhere from, I mean, the focuses really are the Middle East and Southeast Asia at this point. But as we know, there's a lot of animals in the United States. And so really animals go everywhere.
So what do you hope will happen when someone like me sees your film, obviously I'm horrified, but what comes after that?
I think, well, especially for the great apes, there's room for compassion and empathy. I mean, with everything as well, I think empathy is pretty much the key to all of our problems, right? Because it's always something, once you personally become impacted by something, is when you start to make different decisions, right? And there's a ton of documented cases where campaigns like this have had huge impacts, right? A lot of times with film, you don't see the tangible impact right away. But my hope is that we start to treat all species with as they are, like as these big charismatic species, right? I mean, you think about elephants and you think about things that draw people to your local zoo, right? If we thought about, let's say just a regular bird, right, that maybe isn't beautiful, the same way we look at an elephant, I think a lot of things would start to change, and then we would regard some of these species that some of them are endangered and aren't beautiful, right? We start to hold them in higher regards. So I think that's one thing, and another is that I don't know. I might get a little philosophical on you on this one, but I mean, what is the point of life? In my opinion, is to be able to feel and experience emotions, right? And that if that's the main purpose to life, I think a lot of people would agree with me on that. But if that's the purpose, right, of life, wouldn't all these animals that are able to feel that, chimpanzees, dolphins, any of these very intelligent species, wouldn't that make them just as intelligent as us? And in fact, I think we're less intelligent than them because we're not able to live sustainably within our environments, right? So when you look at it from that point of view, I think that these animals are much more important than we are because they have figured out how to live in their environments. And I think it's pretty clear at this point that we don't have that figured out. Um, yeah, so sorry to get philosophical on you, but
No,
that's just my opinion.
no, absolutely. I think it really points to a larger issue, a bigger question, so to speak, and that is what sort of how can we move past or go beyond this systemic failure, I guess, on the part of human beings, if we're going by your philosophy, this failure to live in tandem with our environment and instead turn to living with the environment and with these other species. Is there a way to do that?
Most definitely, yes. Indigenous people have been living in environments for thousands of years sustainably. We need to adapt their models and champion those people and really almost reverse colonialism, right? Colonialism is one of the huge roots of a lot of our problems, right? And I think it could also be, colonialism could be an inherent thing to the human species, which is maybe not so hopeful for us. But the good part about the human species is that we're the most adaptable species on the planet by far, right? We've adapted into pretty much every single environment that the earth has and figured out how to live in those areas, right? So I think we just need to take this blueprint that indigenous people have and apply it to our everyday lives and government, right? And I think that's, really it's not super sexy for a lot of people because everyone says money makes the world go round, right? And money is the main focus of a lot of people's lives. And it's hard to, I think, judge someone for wanting that. But at the same time, once your environment becomes uninhabitable, then we're going to be forced to do this anyway. So
Circling back to your work, do you think that your films carry this motif because you're always dealing with the enslavement of sentient beings? I don't know if other beings can imprison themselves.
It's a hard thing. I think there's a lot of traits that are built into humans that are pretty negative. But I believe in the yin and the yang too. There is a lot of positive things, and we see ways to do things correctly, and there are ways to, whatever it may be, sustainable agriculture, agroforestry, things like that. There are ways to make it sustainable. And I think in a lot of studies throughout the world, we're finding that when we do allow the environment to really reboot itself, it does it at a pretty quick rate. And that's very encouraging, especially in areas of tropical rainforest where we probably need it most at this point, for holding some of the carbon that we're going to need it to hold for this kind of looming huge threat of climate change that doesn't feel like it's there to pretty much the affluent populations in the world.
How do you relate to people while also pointing out their shortcomings or their weaknesses as a species?
Yeah, I think that's it's a very, very difficult thing to do. And I have a perfect example of it, actually. So we're trying to relocate this only gorilla in Thailand. And first of all, like, who cares, right? Like, why would you care about one gorilla? I think, a little bit of a side note, I think that I care because it represents a global change, right? In shutting down probably the most notorious zoo in the world. Decades of documented illegal trafficking, right? And Thailand is also one of the epicenter, if not the epicenter, for wildlife trafficking, right? At least it's the most visible there. I would argue that China is probably doing a lot of it too. It's just not as visible because of the Great Firewall. But to kind of like circle back around, there's an owner to this zoo, right? Tapada Zoo. And in Thailand, losing face is it's a big deal, right? So you do not want to be shamed socially ever. It's almost the death of you, as how they perceive it, right? So how do we shut down this zoo? And how do we do it so we don't kill this person, right? And not like literally, but socially in a way. And I think that's been an interesting conversation because the main subject of the film, Sanjira Apatan, talks about fighting with compassion and love, and it's a Buddhist mentality. She's a Buddhist nun, and so I think that's one thing. It's like being like, hey, like we need to hold you accountable to some of the travesties that you've done, but like this is like a learning point, not just for you, but hopefully for Thailand and the world, right? To say that we can still love animals and be integrated with them and experience them, but we need to do it in like the right way, and so that's been an interesting relationship as this film is it's in production right now, and it might be a couple more years before this actually is finished. But how do we make sure that we're not alienating those people further, right? Because then if you just keep on alienating someone and telling them that they're wrong, it's just going to make it worse. And that's why I think fighting with compassion and love and is like super, super important, and making sure that not only that we save these animals, but that we save this person's face and that we don't ruin this person's life and their integrity, even though they may be doing illegal things. And it's a cultural difference, right? Which like leads you to a whole nother question, like how do we change culture, right? And I think, in my opinion, the power of film is one of the keys to that, right? I think you've seen it in so many different examples throughout the world. I mean, if you ever seen the film Blackfish, I think we've started to, after that film, really look at how we've treated like killer whales and going to that facility in San Diego. I think that the public perception of that has changed huge. Or another example even is Steve Galster. He's the founder of Freeland that I was talking about earlier. He ran a shark fin campaign in Thailand and found like a celebrity to be paired with it. And after all of that went through, they saw a 70% reduction in shark fin soup in Thailand, right? And he ended up getting sued by some sort of like union in Thai court because of that. And he ended up winning the case, right? So I think it's like, if we can use film and put campaigns behind it, I think that there's like a true chance at actually making change. I mean, the list goes on and on when you see this like major shift in cultures. Like Seaspiracy is probably one of the biggest ones, right? We've seen kind of like, oh, we're polluting the ocean, like very bad from just dumping and whatnot. And then you realize that like 60% or whatever the number it was of plastic in the ocean is from overfishing. So the power of film, I think, is immense, right? And sometimes it's not as clear cut, right? Like, oh, wow, like this film had this amazing outcome. It debunked this oil rig or this huge mining operation, or protect this indigenous land. I mean, I do see those all the time. But for example, like my film, someone might have seen it and decided that they needed to check for if this zoo is accredited, or they might start questioning someone, right, that has a baby ape. Or, you know, sometimes it's hard to see the impact that you have, but it does happen, and often it happens in minds of people. So it's a hard thing to really grab onto.
And to measure, right? I mean, it's hard to know how many folks out there are questioning, you know, the local zoo that doesn't have an accreditation. But the fact is that there's a strong likelihood that a lot of people do walk away with more than they walked in with. You know, even asking questions can make a difference, as you just discussed. And I think it's really interesting the cultural differences you mentioned, and not just in, you know, the shark fin soup, but also in the way that there was a need, or I guess a desire to save this person's, to save face, this person's reputation. Where I know that in a lot of, you know, my background is journalism, and in a lot of situations you see the audience, or even the folks carrying out the investigation or the product, and they're trying to bust or bring down this person. Maybe they're in a position of authority, and maybe they're not. Maybe they're, you know, they have a responsibility to answer to the public. You kind of break away from a lot of that. Do you think that that's due to your experiences with other cultures? And if so, what are you taking away that you're then able to use in life and in your other films?
I don't know. I think that personally, my films, I like to leave them on a hopeful note, and figure out not to just like make a piece about like, hey, this is the problem. I want to make a piece that say, hey, this is the problem, and these are potential solutions, or this is the solution, right? And say that we do, you know, there is multiple reasons for hope, right? And ways that we can get there. Because some of the topics that I deal with, it's just, you know, you're watching it and you're like, I can't believe someone would do that. How is that happening? Who's letting this happen? And most of the time, pretty much 100% of the time, it's a lack of education, right? And, you know, for example, the owner of Pada Zoo, like, you know, in Buddhism, animals are regarded as sacred, right? So he might feel that that's a sacred place for him and his people, right? And to come in there and just talk a bunch of trash about him is like almost talking trash about their culture. So it's like almost the last thing you want to do, right? You want to come in and say, hey, what if we give her this bigger sanctuary and she's with other gorillas and the end of her life is good? that's like a hopeful message, and one that people can get on board with, because there's always these huge topics of conversation about restorative justice, and especially in the United States, right? And essentially that's forgiveness. I mean, do we not believe in forgiveness anymore? And I think a lot of people say, no, you did this, right? You see it all the time with incarcerated people. Be like, oh, you're doing 20 years. What did you do? Right? Not, hey, what happened to you to make you do that? Right? It's only what you did. Not, and there's like no empathy in that. There's no empathy, right? And I think I'm obviously a huge Jane Goodall fan, but I think that her message of empathy is like spot on, right? Like that is the key to everything, right? I mean, and that's not just like fixing great ape trafficking. That could be the key to like fixing your love life, your relationships, I mean, anything, right? Is if you can feel for someone and how they feel, right, then you might be actually able to change that person or change that culture.
I'm curious, you mentioned Jane Goodall. What are some of the other activists or filmmakers whom you really admire and who might influence your work?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I think um, one film that had a big impact on me was The Game Changers by James Cameron. And it's just interesting because you see all of the work of James Cameron, and then he comes out with a film about being vegan, and it's just like shows the depth of him, really. And I know a lot of people, they either hate him or they love him, but that film was like had an incredible impact on me. I think I went vegan for like 5 months after I watched that. And my friend that I watched it with I think it was 3 years ago now, is vegan till this day, right? So I love that. I love all of the people that are the first three women that really went to study great apes. And so that's Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, and Barudate Galadikas. I always forget her full name, but I think their stories are incredible. Not only just like the immense amount of research that they have done and their discoveries, but their books, their first original books about their experience are fascinating. I think they're probably my three favorite books I've ever read. The first one is Jane Goodall, In the Shadow of a Man. And that one is just an incredible adventure and discovery story about her basically, in Tanzania and her journey. And then there's Gorillas in the Mist, which is Diane Fossey. Unfortunately, her life was ended a little bit too early to probably reach her full potential. But that's because she loved her work, and she paid the ultimate price for it. And then Barudate's book is called, I think it's called Reflections of Eden, which I ended up thinking was probably the best of all three, seeing that she probably doesn't get as much credit as Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey. But I mean, really, these are the three first women, or doesn't even matter, three first people to study great apes and a long form, which is fascinating to me. So I think I really look up to those three and the work that they've done. I also really appreciate a German documentary filmmaker called Oliver Gotzel. He probably doesn't know that. I met him at a film festival, but his work is really, really incredible. And he was just like a great guy. So I love his films. I think he's got a film that's been on the circuit called The Kings of Bioko, which is the island right off of like kind of West Central Africa. And it's just, beautiful, beautiful filmmaking. All of his stuff just feels timeless. Trying to figure out who else, but I can go on forever about my, inspirations and whatnot.
Yeah, I figured you probably could, but it was great to get kind of a taste. What else haven't I asked you that you think is interesting or important for folks to know about you or your work?
Hmm. I don't know. I think it's I think my work is very there's a lot of like prep behind it, right? And then when you watch the film, there's kind of like usually a big emotional reaction, and hopefully an impact, right? But I think there's not much that's different from me and someone with a camera phone, right? I think that if you see injustice, right, and that's what most of my films come down to, is injustice, right? If you see injustice happening, like in that moment, you can become a filmmaker, and people don't see it like that, right? But you have the power to pick up your phone and record something, which is like I don't think people really understand the impact of that. I think we're starting to see it, especially with discrimination against African American people in the United States, right? We're just it's not like this stuff just started happening to African Americans. We're just uncovering it because of phones and camera phones. So I think that if you see those injustices, right, you can become a filmmaker, even if it's like a clip, right? All of a sudden, if you have something that's a documented injustice, right, which is essentially the basis of all the work that I do, then you have the power as well, right? So, mine might be a little bit more fancy of a film and like more articulated, but really moments that are truly free of bias and you can see injustices happening, um, play a huge role in how we're going to be going forward in our society. Um, yeah, that's I think that everyone really does have the power, and that's a unique thing about the time we're living in. And so we need to take that and harness that momentum to combat whatever it may be, any injustice, which pretty much any injustice feeds into climate change. And I know that's, a big leap, and I can connect all those dots for you pretty much on almost any injustice. But when it's boiled down to it, that's what it comes down to.
I gotta ask you about that because I haven't heard that.
Yeah, I think, there's, when you look at injustice, right? And that's when I kind of, with my films, a lot of people bring stories to me, right? And I look at it and I say, is this an injustice, right? And if it is, then that hits my bottom line for potentially making a film about it, right? And then I kind of go down, the ladder. But you think about an example, African Americans. I live in Milwaukee. I live in the most segregated city in the nation at this point, right? And you look at people that are Black living in, the Black neighborhood, right? All of the climate change impacts will be happening to them first compared to the affluent white neighborhood, whether it be pollution. I mean, that would be your big one, air pollution, or they're closer to all these, different plants that are putting out chemicals, things like that. So that's, now to feed that back into, global change, right? So once we change that, right, for this group of people, so there's equity in breathing fresh air for everyone, then everyone's breathing fresh air, and that feeds into the climate change issue, right? And so another example, like great apes, like how does that impact climate change, right? I mean, a lot of these bigger charismatic species are kind of like bioindicators that of healthy environments, right? So if we're removing all of those species from those environments, it allows not only like encroachment, but deforestation, farming, and that's cutting down rainforest, right? So you're removing the species, then you're allowing for that habitat to be destroyed because those species aren't there, not living there, right? And even so, it doesn't really matter. Most people just go in there and cut down the forest anyway. But then you're allowing for this other problem to happen, which is not allowing for carbon storage by cutting down rainforest, right? So I think that's kind of like, the inequity for people, especially people of color. I think in the United States, it plays into climate change, and we don't directly see it that way, right? Because it is very, very indirect. And I'm sure all the conservative people out there are saying that I'm just some crazy liberal, but that's really not the case. I mean, I think there's documented cases of this all throughout the world, right? And climate deniers, it's almost comical because they've done no research. They've done no research about how many different tools we have to measure climate change and how we're exponentially getting there faster and faster and faster. So, you know, I can rant on and on and on about it, but everything we do has an impact on our environment and our climate, right? You know, unfortunately, Christmas does, right? You have this huge, huge surge in the economy, and it booms, right? People make more clothes, they make more trinkets, they make more of this, they eat more food. So it's a giant consumption all sped up, which, I mean, I can tell you what, you know, large scale farming and large scale textile industry does for the environment. It's not a good thing. So to wrap it around and be hopeful again, we need to adapt indigenous ways of living with our environment.
What are some of the things that you've really enjoyed working on, or some of the things that you look forward to working on again because they were so great?
Ooh, I have a couple ideas for a film. I'm making a personal film right now that is about post-traumatic stress and the impact of war. And I think I'm finding that I'm really loving working on that film, as difficult as it may be. My grandparents lived in Holland during World War II. And when they were 24, their farm became occupied by the Nazis, and they had 3 little kids. And so my grandparents were part of the Dutch underground, hiding and saving Jewish lives, which I love looking at the history of that and just realizing how good I have it at this point, and that, you know, we do see a lot of negativity in the world, but there's a lot of hope based around that. And you see how resilient my grandparents were, and, you know, the impact of that on their mental health, especially my grandfather. And that resiliency is it's just so hopeful and gives me so much energy to kind of like finish the films that I'm making. But I get to work on a number of different films. Pretty lucky. So I'm enjoying making the incarceration film as well. It's focused on a woman, Julie Majors, who is the director of the Maryland Coalition of Prisoner Rights. And she is just so voracious, and just like, she's basically almost like a self-taught lawyer. You know, she didn't go to law school, but you can see that she saw a major injustice in the world, and is like filling this incredible gap of reforming Maryland's correctional system. And it's just like mind-blowing to see people kind of on the front lines doing that work. I think that's one really great thing about this job, besides being able to travel to a few cool places, is that you see people that have thrown their lives away to live this new life of being hopeful and being resilient. And I think those people, there's just so much character and so much depth to those people that you find a newfound respect for humanity, which, let me tell you, is not anywhere to be seen in our current state of politics. So that's something that I mean, I really enjoy doing, is seeing that. It gives me a lot of energy to kind of keep going on.
And that ties directly into my next question, which was going to be, how do you balance all the depressing stuff you see all the time? And I guess it's, like you said, that hope.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do really like watching comedy films. That kind of is like an interesting contrast. I love watching documentaries, but I make sure that I am able to laugh somehow too. So I do like watching, you know, just kind of goofy comedies, or even sometimes like, like that 70s show or something that's just very, it's very like kind of like shallow almost, but it's like easy to laugh at. And so I like watching stuff like that too once in a while. But I think there's a lot of highs and lows, and some days you're just like, can I still be a filmmaker? Can I still do this? I think according to the International Documentary Association, only 80% of or only 20% of filmmakers that are making documentaries are doing it full time. So, and then it's even like a crazier stat, like most documentaries filmmakers like will make one film, like 95% of them will make one film in their life, and that'll be it. And so, a lot of this stuff kind of like takes it out of you. And I've been there a few times at low points where I was just like, how am I going to do this? I don't know. Like it's just like kind of like an unknown sometimes. But when, like I said, when you're on a high and maybe your film is finally made and it's seen, and it's, you're seeing an impact, it's like an incredible feeling. And with one of my films that I made in Panama, I was talking about earlier, a film festival was blossomed out of making that film through Freeland. It's called the Freeland Film Festival, and I'm on the board of that. And then I've been connected with so many other filmmakers to make new films, as well as like have support globally. And that was just like a very unique thing. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot of highs and lows, but I think at the end of the day, how do you measure success? I measure it by impact. Most filmmakers that are doing it constantly measure it by, am I able to make another film, right? It's hard to not agree with that. It's really hard not to agree with that, because once you've made a film and it's taken kind of a part of your soul, are you willing to do that again? That's a big question. I think that I'm lucky that I'm able to do that.
Listening to you talk about, do I want to do that again? I thought about, and the awareness that you're aiming to create, the concept of ignorance is bliss, right? So the idea that you can't really go back once you've taken the red pill, and these things, and you've got it on your conscience, and you want to make a difference, and you've got it on your conscience, and you can never go back to not knowing. For me, I'll be frank, it's difficult sometimes to sit through something and then to walk away being like, oh, that hurt my heart. Did you ever have that experience?
Yeah, I think it's I've had it a few times. I forget, there's been a number of films made about Standing Rock. And then there was one, I forget who directed it, but it was a beautifully made film, and it was just like the comparisons to the paradigm of history and how it was repeating itself again was just like, the weight on it was just kind of like, oh, like I've got to change my whole life. Like that's a hard thing to deal with. And it's hard to get people to think outside of their own brain. Like, and it's hard to like blame anyone for not being able to do that, right? Especially you talk about a lot of people who have major traumas, right? And there's a lot of unseen mental enslavement, right? And a lot of people don't look at it that way, but it does inhibit you from doing things once you have some major traumas. And you got to make a choice at your point is like, all right, am I going to move into fight or flight? I can only think about myself because I have so many problems and I can't fix them myself. So I can't think about your problem. And I think I see that a lot within I mean, impoverished communities around the world, right? Like, how can you expect those people to care about a chimpanzee when they're seeing their people die from hunger and thirst, right? Like, it kind of puts a life into perspective when you think about it like that, right? But I think I'm answering your question. I just I rant a little bit, but
No, you
you know,
did, because and I thought about blinders. That word came to mind too. You know, a lot of folks, especially in the United States, and I think a lot of, just since I've been talking to folks outside of the States, they're so much more knowledgeable than we are in the United States about things that are happening all over the world. And I think a lot of the folks here, again, walk around with blinders. If it's not affecting me, then, because I got all this stuff I got to take care of too. And so, and I'll make this my last question, unless you have anything to add, but how do you break through that? How do you break through that?
yeah, that's
Make people care, you know?
I mean, that's the ultimate question, right? Like, how, like, why should I care? Why should I care? And I mean, unfortunately, the paradigm of history is that nothing really gets done until the affluent are impacted, right? And you look at the United States, right? And the geography of the United States. You look at Wisconsin, right? You have the biggest segregated city in the nation, Milwaukee. Then you have rural Wisconsin, right? So if I grew up in rural Wisconsin and I'm part of the generational wealth that has come to white people, like, I have land, I have my life, I don't have to worry about any problems. Like, why should I care about anything else, right? Until my life is impacted, because nothing will change. Why am I going to give my $5, my $10 to save the apes? So I think it's like, you're right. What this is like the ultimate question. How do we get people to move, right? And I think it's feeling, like, I circle back, but it's feeling empathy, right? And film is the best way to reach them. And I think this is like I said, I do it in a fancy way, but it's doesn't need to be, right? Like, the person that held up the video of George Floyd being of him dying and being murdered now, you know, officially according to Chauvin, right? Like, now that has touched and influenced a lot of people, right? To say, okay, oh, there is some systemic racism going on here, and changed a lot of minds, right? So for me, the key is film, right? And I can make it look fancy, but until we all are able to see and feel the injustice, right? That's the important one, is feel the injustice. That's when true change happens. And that's how we can influence people. And I think you saw that, right? I mean, you see a whole generation of young people connecting with that moment with George Floyd, and then taking to the streets, right? And I think we're not going to see the dividends of that moment until those people come into power, right? And they implement their policies that have been influenced by something that they can't unsee. So yeah, empathy and film are the key, in my opinion.
Wonderful.
Mhm.
Colin, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Where can we find more of your work?
My work is at colinsytsma.com, or woodgrainmedia.com is my production company. And then we have a YouTube channel, Woodgrain Media TV, and I've got a lot of my films on there. And Vimeo, variety of outlets. I get to shoot a lot of films for PBS's Independent Lens, which is their national series. And yeah, I've done journalistic work for Al Jazeera here in Wisconsin before, so I'm
So
kind of
we
all
might,
over the place.
yeah, we might come across your work and not even know it. That's awesome.
Hopefully.